Hello, I'm Burt Clark. This presentation is the one I was supposed to give at the 25th EFO Graduate Symposium about my seatbelt research I was doing at Johns Hopkins University. The day before I was to deliver it, I had a heart attack at the Fire Academy, so I never got to deliver it. The materials were handed out, but I never delivered it. Keep in mind, this is a draft. I never did 100% complete the project. It got to a draft stage. I felt very comfortable presenting it to the 25th EFO graduates because many of them were the subjects of the case study. So that's what this presentation was intended to do. Keep in mind that this presentation was never officially sanctioned by Johns Hopkins, so I didn't want to give that impression. It was never submitted for referee review, so that's why it stays in a draft format. I did it while I was a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins. I was also still employed at the National Fire Academy, neither of which I still am. I retired in 2014, but I still am working as a reviewer for the NIOSH Firefighter Occupational Fatality Studies. We're coming up on the 30th EFO Graduate Symposium, so I felt like I had to complete this project, and I'm going to be posting it online for those that are interested. So thank you. This is the presentation. I want to thank my two Johns Hopkins advisors, Dr. Porter and Dr. Fatality, who helped me tremendously during my time at Johns Hopkins. I valued their guidance, and I learned a lot. One of my big disappointments is that I never actually published it. But I still think the material is good. They did not approve the material, so keep that in mind. I'll share the process or methodology that I used as I go along. So this is the presentation. Basically, the research questions I wanted to find out were, what are the culture factors that explain firefighters not using seatbelts? And then, what were the change factors that help firefighters start to use their seatbelts? And to do that, I applied the Schein, Edgar Schein's models of organizational culture and change in terms of trying to understand why firefighters don't wear their seatbelt and what has to happen for them to start wearing their seatbelt. Dr. Schein is a professor emeritus from MIT and the guru, if you will, of organizational culture. There were 11 cases. The cases were actual seatbelt stories that 11 subjects or people wrote. The cases came from fire departments from 8 states and the District of Columbia. All the people that wrote the cases were National Fire Academy students, and in many, many cases they were personal friends of mine. The way it started, they told me their personal seatbelt story or something they experienced, and then I asked them to write it up. After we talked about it, I asked them to write it. And then once they sent that written material to me, I incorporated that into an article that then I wrote around their article, their story, and then those papers were published in various online and paper fire service publications between 2003 and 2009. So that set of written documentation in terms of what those individuals wrote were the content that was then analyzed as a case study to identify questions 1 and 2, and then to make the decision as to whether or not the Schein model was useful in understanding firefighter seatbelt behavior. The reports or the stories that they wrote, they were not given any direction in terms of how to write their story. But when you read the stories, basically they follow the normal process of who, what, when, where, why, and how. And they did it most likely, usually from a personal level. In other words, their personal experience with seatbelts. In other words, if they did wear their seatbelt, if they didn't wear their seatbelt, and why. And then what prompted them to change their seatbelt behavior. Then they also many times reported the group activity around seatbelts. And then finally, the organizational activity, and in many cases that ended up dealing with the National Fire Service Seatbelt Pledge Campaign and whether or not their organization took the pledge. So again, when they wrote their stories, I was not thinking about this research. I was just using it to tell seatbelt stories in the hopes of getting more people to put their seatbelt on. So here's the individuals and where they're from. I don't include the names. They are public information because they were all printed. But you can see the subjects, in other words, the individuals, were mostly chief officers, from fire chiefs to battalion chiefs. There was one driver at the time. He was a driver. There was one lieutenant at the time, a lieutenant, and then finally the one down the bottom, Team Brian. They're identified as Team Brian because they wrote their story as a team, even though one person probably penned it. They refer to themselves as a team. You can see the states they came from. Then the individual stories were just numbered 1 through 11. You can see the states they came from. Then the question. Oh, while we're at the states, all the states had mandatory seatbelt laws except one. So that's the double star in terms of that state did not have a mandatory seatbelt policy for first responders or firefighters. They exempted them from wearing seatbelts. The next column, in other words, did the fire department experience a line of duty death from a motor vehicle accident? And you can see that most of them did not. 3 of them, the bottom 3, did have seatbelt related fatalities that the authors experienced firsthand. In other words, they were on the job when that incident happened and their firefighter friend or subordinate or something died as a result of that crash. One of them, the driver in Mississippi, they had a seatbelt fatality back in 2007. Part of this subject's experience was he didn't know that when he was on the fire department. That was not talked about. So part of the process is him learning about that incident and then how that changed him. And finally, over on the last side, 100% pledge. In other words, the yeses are the departments that actually had taken the National Seatbelt Pledge and got their pledge certificate. So many of them had actually done that in terms of that person that had that seatbelt experience was the catalyst, if you will, for encouraging or getting the fire department to take the seatbelt pledge. So those are just a little background information on the Schein models. In Schein's book, the culture model is made up of 3 factors he talks about in terms of the artifacts. That's the hard stuff that you can see, touch, feel. Then there's the espoused beliefs. That's what we say to each other in terms of why we do certain things. And then finally, Schein talks about the underlying assumptions. This is what he refers to as the DNA of an organization, meaning that it's the fundamental driving force behind our behavior, but sometimes we don't even know where it comes from. And he uses the term DNA to explain that those underlying assumptions are passed down generation after generation after generation. But Schein talks about when you do a culture work, an organization, you really do have to find out all these different levels. Once they're identified, consciously or subconsciously, then the next stage is the change model. And Schein uses this, and he talks about our behavior we develop and we start doing all the time, and almost becomes unconscious. We just keep doing it repeatedly, it becomes the norm. So he says to overcome an individual behavior, you have to unfreeze. In other words, you have to start seeing what you're doing as not right, unacceptable. And he says that usually happens because of some external information that you receive that starts you to start questioning your behavior. Then the next phase is what Schein refers to as cognitive restructuring. It's a mental process you do inside yourself that says, what I've been doing is not correct. So I need to change that behavior. And that this new behavior is doable. I can do this behavior. I can learn how to do it. I have the materials to do it, and I can do it. So then you start doing it. Then you go through this rephrasing step, where the new behavior now becomes the norm, and you get to that level by practicing it, by getting other people to do it with you, and then finally getting organizational support for the new behavior. So these are the Schein models that I use. And a big thing about Schein talking about culture and change, one of his basic premises, that you don't change culture per se, you have to change behavior. And you change behaviors one at a time. That's why I think seatbelts is such a good model in terms of causing effective change within the fire service at the individual, group, and organizational level, because it's not just a broad brush kind of thing. It's a very specific behavior, and it's only behaviors that we can see and really evaluate. So I think seatbelts gives us that opportunity, and you'll see that if it works with seatbelts, then the idea is it may work with other kinds of behaviors. So a qualitative method was used, very individual. So I personally read all the cases over again. I identified the factors, whether they were change factors or culture factors. I did the coding and came up with the coding. It was a manual process. I did not use a computer-generated software package to do this. I just did it individually, sitting and reading stuff, underlying, coloring, and identifying the factors. There was no external review or evaluation, so this is certainly all my own thoughts and observations. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of personal bias of my own in there, and I accept that, and I realize that that's an issue anytime you do qualitative kind of research, specifically when it's case study, and I was the only one doing the evaluation. So it's just one person looking at a set of data, trying to identify factors associated with culture and then change. So this is what I discovered. In terms of artifacts, in other words, the actual hard things that you can see, did they have a seatbelt policy? Yes. I think all the departments had a seatbelt policy. Was there a seatbelt in the apparatus? In other words, did they have a seatbelt to actually wear? That was a factor. So under artifacts, I came up with two factors. Did they have a policy? Was there a seatbelt? Then under the espoused beliefs, what were the subjects saying in terms of what was driving their behavior, specifically not wearing seatbelts? And two came out. Most prevalently, they were putting on their PPE or dressing in PPE, or putting on their SCBA, donning SCBA. So those were the two espoused beliefs. And in the underlying assumptions, they talked about or realized that the risk of not putting a seatbelt on became normalized. They didn't use the word normalized. They said, I didn't realize I wouldn't put my seatbelt on. And actually, some of them talked about how they wore the seatbelt when they were on the ambulance, but when they got on a fire truck, they didn't see the non-seatbelt use as a problem. So that risk was invisible to them. And then the notion of being fast. They needed to be fast. So fast, moving quickly, being fast was a recurring factor in the analysis. So it ended up there were 6 culture factors that identified, and then you can see the coding behind it. You'll see later on when I report out the data. So if you see the P, that's the policy. SA, there was a seatbelt in the apparatus. Donning PPE, donning SCBA, risk, and then needing to be fast. Next, I coded or identified and then coded the unfreezing and cognitive restructuring and refreezing. So in the Schein book, he talks about to unfreeze, individuals or organizations need some new disconfirming information. In other words, something has to get their attention that what they are doing is unacceptable or wrong or doesn't meet their objectives. And that was reported by the subject in the case study. Then that newfound sense of disconfirming information gives the subject a sense of failure, that they are not living up to their own standard. So that they start to have this internal challenge that I need to do things differently. The next step is this cognitive restructuring. So the individual looks at the old behavior, in this case not using seatbelts, and it's dissatisfying. In other words, they felt bad when they didn't put their seatbelt on, and it made them feel wrong. So there really is this an affective aspect to change, that's what's going to drive you. That you thought you were a good firefighter because you were being fast putting your seatbelt on, and now you're saying, you know, good firefighters put their seatbelt on. So by me not doing it, I'm not being a good firefighter. So this behavior, the old behavior, becomes dissatisfying and wrong. Then you have to start seeing the new behavior of using seatbelts as the right behavior and doable, because you actually have to start thinking about doing it. So you force yourself to do the new behavior. It may feel uncomfortable in the beginning. You got to think about it. You got to look around. Other people may think you look funny, but you're committed to doing this new behavior. So as you get better at it, then the refreezing process starts, because now you do the new behavior. You perform the behavior, and you start to get others to do the behavior with you. So now it becomes the norm, so because others around you are doing it. So now you're helping to reinforce each other in terms of this new correct behavior. And then by making this organizational commitment, in other words, getting the whole department to say, yes, seat belts is important. And in this particular case, they used the seatbelt pledge as a public pronouncement that they were going to put seatbelts on now because that was the right thing to do. So here's the chart. If it was projected on a wall, it's probably hard to see, but looking at it on your screen is probably pretty easy. You can see the case studies are just listed. Those are just the individuals, the story that they wrote. Then the artifacts, the espoused beliefs, and the assumptions. So those first three columns represent the 6 culture factors. Then you've got unfreezing, cognitive restructuring, and refreezing, which represent the 3 categories in the change culture. So then I just used the code. In other words, they had a seatbelt policy. All of the cases had seatbelt policies. All of the subjects had seatbelts in their apparatus, so they had them to wear. So the artifacts, all of them showed up in all 11 cases. Under the espoused beliefs, you can we start to have changes. But in quite a few cases, all of them that they talked about putting on their personal protective equipment and donning their SCBA as their espoused justifications for not putting their seatbelt on. Then many of them, you can see how many talked about that the risk of not putting seatbelts became invisible to them. They didn't see it because nobody else was putting their seatbelt on. And then they had to be fast. So you can see they became pretty high factors too. So those are the culture factors. And you can see 4 of them got all the factors in their reports. 2 of them got 14, 1 got 13, and 3 got 12. So now moving over to the cognitive or the change aspects. Unfreezing, again, they all got new information. And in many cases, that new information was a lecture that I had given or an article that I had written, and that's how they came to me because, you know, in the relationship with us, somehow I was the one that gave them the new information or challenged them, and that spurred them on to looking at their own personal seatbelt behavior. So they reported that out. So all of them reported that out. And then 10 of them reported that they saw this as not correct, as some level of failure on their part because they weren't doing what they should be doing. In terms of the cognitive restructuring, most all of them reported all the factors in terms of realizing that what they were doing was dissatisfying, it was wrong, that the new behavior was the right thing to do, and it was doable. They could actually, because they wore their seatbelt someplace else, they could certainly teach themselves to wear it in the fire truck. And then the refreezing process went through many of the, all the factors where they practiced doing it, they got others to do it, and then finally 7 of the organizations took the National Seatbelt Pledge. So from this you can see that, I'll give the results, my conclusions later on, but it seems like the Schein model does kind of explain why we don't use seatbelts, and then the process we have to go through to change our seatbelt behavior to become seatbelt users. So, as anybody knows, there's always limitations to any kind of research. So some of the most prevalent ones for this one are there's no direct observational data of the cases. You know, I didn't see any of the stuff that the people wrote about. So that's an issue. You know, we have no observational data. We're relying on their case studies and the correctness and truthfulness of the articles they wrote. I assume they're correct and truthful. The 10 authors wrote from their own personal point of view. One, Team Brian, wrote as a team, but one person wrote it. So again, you have one person telling a story. If many people told the stories, that would be another level of sophistication in terms of doing this analysis. But we have these 11 cases, and that's a starting point. The stories were not written to the Schein model, because when I first started asking people to do this, I had not read Schein, and I was not thinking about applying the Schein model to seatbelts. The present seatbelt reality in the 11 departments is not known. In other words, did the change take effect? Did it hold? Are they still wearing seatbelts? We don't know. And then finally, all the cases came from career fire departments, and we know that the majority of fire departments are volunteer. So we don't have any visibility in terms of applying this information or process to volunteer fire departments. So those are the limitations to this study. So discussion. I think the Schein model, in terms of understanding and identifying an organizational culture, is very good, and it was useful in the 11 cases it was used on to identify why they did not use seatbelts, and then the change process needed to get the individuals and others to start being seatbelt users. So it did work in these 11 cases. So another discussion point, using the model as a theory-based assessment and intervention to address firefighter morbidity and mortality related to seatbelt doctrine in fire departments has high potential. Fancy words for, I think other people can use this model to understand their own seatbelt behavior and hopefully change their behavior in their organizations. And taking it one step further, down the bottom, because this is the one most far away from what could be, is that the Schein models of culture and change may be useful tools in analyzing and addressing other behaviors or lack of behaviors that contribute to firefighter occupational injury and death. In other words, this is a first step in saying the Schein models of culture and change, if they work with seat belts, then they may be able to work with the many other behaviors that firefighters perform, which today we see as unacceptable, that need to be changed. Well, you have to understand them before you can change them. So these are the 3 discussion points that I put. and the recommendations. Following from that, what do you do with this? So again, realize that most of these were done back in 2013. One of the recommendations was for the NIOSH firefighter occupational fatality study to incorporate the Schein model to identify artifacts, espoused beliefs, and underlying assumptions that contribute to firefighter fatalities. At the present time, the NIOSH reports are not about culture and change or culture issues. They don't identify that. They just stick with engineering and factual-based stuff. They don't do any interpretation of it, and I don't know if they can ever really do that. But if culture is such a big issue that we identify today, that may be something that the NIOSH folks want to start thinking about, because we do know that culture drives behavior. Then the Fallen Firefighters Foundation may use the Schein model to help define fire service culture in terms of artifacts, espoused beliefs, and underlying assumptions that explain the discipline's safety culture or lack of safety culture. Again, the first group to identify culture as an issue in the fire service or safety culture was the Fallen Firefighters Foundation way back when they first did their 16 life safety initiatives, and culture is issue number 1. So that's actually when I started doing my work on culture, and hopefully this study can contribute to that. And then the other recommendation is the Schein model may help the Fallen Firefighters Foundation identify strategies for unfreezing, supporting cognitive restructuring, and refreezing of safety behavior, incorporating leadership, management, supervision, accountability, and personal responsibility. So that was the other big recommendation that I was making to the folks that are trying to help keep us safe. Future research. When I first did this, basically the big idea I had was that to use the Schein model to conduct an actual experimental intervention in a fire department to actually identify and change seatbelt behavior. In other words, actually go into a fire department and work with them to help them identify their seatbelt behavior, the artifacts, the espoused beliefs, the underlying assumptions, and then actually try to do change intervention of getting them to unfreeze, go through the cognitive restructuring process, and then refreeze with a new behavior. In preparing for this, I decided to add another point to this, since it's 2018 now, and those original 11 departments have not had any follow-up. I'm also recommending to do a follow-up study of the 11 original fire departments to identify their present seatbelt behavior, to find out over time if they've continued their seatbelt use behavior, because that could be helpful in terms of longitudinally understanding what it takes to become a seatbelt using organization. So since I did the research, the U.S. Fire Administration gave a grant to the International Association of Firefighters, Fire Chiefs, to do a study, or to come up with a report called the National Safety Culture Change Initiative. This document is online. I did participate in this work before I retired from the Fire Academy. So it's very good stuff. It's got a lot of the Schein material and other kind of culture material in there. It is available online. And one of the recommendations from that is that this firefighter safety culture web page was created. So you can see the address for that, and that's got videos and materials and all kinds of stuff that can be used about culture. And specifically in the document, there's a whole section on seatbelts, specifically on seatbelts. So that shows you the importance of that particular issue. And then finally, for those that have read my book or seen my book, there's a whole chapter on culture, which also includes many of the case studies that were used in this. And then there's a whole chapter on seatbelts in terms of many of the articles that I published about seatbelts over the time. So those are some additional resources. So again, I want to thank Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, the Center for Injury Research and Policy for allowing me to be part of them. I learned a lot one of the biggest disappointments in my career is that I never actually published this report, but having a heart attack was a significant emotional event, and that took less priority. But I survived, and we're still here. We're about to have the 30th EFO Graduate Symposium, and I thought this material could help some folks individually start wearing their seatbelts if they're not, because unfortunately we're still having seatbelt fatalities, and firefighters are still falling out of fire trucks because they don't have their seatbelts on. So we have not solved that problem. And my basic point is that if we can't solve the seatbelt problem, how can we solve the more complicated issues? So by understanding this seatbelt issue completely, I think that'll give us good theory, research, science, and intervention strategies to actually be able to tackle the other myriad of incidents or issues that the fire service faces. So with that, I'm Burt Clark.